I'll give you $100,000 if you serve me in Chinese. Richard Blackwood's voice rang through the hall of the Prestige Club, Manhattan's priciest restaurant, making all conversations stop right away. The green bills landed on Jasmine's silver tray like physical insults. One by one, $100,000 spread across the shiny metal, making a disgusting scene that pulled every wealthy New Yorker's eyes toward her. Jasmine Williams was 29 years old and never thought her life as a language doctor would become a daily fight to survive. There she stood in her perfect black uniform serving $5,000 bottle champagne to men who wouldn't even glance at her face when they gave their orders. Richard leaned back in his Italian leather chair. A mean smile spread across his fake-tanned face. "What's wrong, honey? Isn't $100,000 enough?" He waved toward the 3 Japanese investors sitting at his table. "My friends here will decide whether your Chinese sounds real." The whole restaurant had turned into a modern gladiator arena. Diners at other tables pretended to study their lobster dishes, but everyone was listening to the embarrassment show Richard was putting on. It was Tuesday night in the money center of New York, where men like him controlled the fate of whole economies before dessert. Jasmine looked at the money scattered on her tray. $100,000. It was more than her pay for 2 years as a waitress. It was enough to cover her mother's medical bills, to pull her younger sister out of the struggling public school, to finally breathe without that pressure in her chest that had followed her for 3 years. But she knew it wasn't about money. It was about power. It was about Richard Blackwood, a 52-year-old real estate boss, showing important investors that he was in charge, that he could embarrass a simple black waitress just because he could. "You know what's best?" Richard kept going, clapping his hands slowly in fake applause. "If you fail, you'll have to say sorry here in front of everyone for wasting our time, because I bet my fortune you don't even know how to say thank you in Chinese." The Japanese investors' laughter was awkward, pushed. One of them, an older man with gold-rimmed glasses, frowned with clear discomfort. Jasmine took a deep breath. Her fingers pressed into the side of the tray until her knuckles turned white. For a quick moment, she thought about her old life when she was Dr. Jasmine Williams, when she gave talks at international universities, when her name meant academic excellence. 3 years ago, everything had crashed when her mother was diagnosed with cancer. The medical bills, the bankruptcy, the loss of everything. Now she was here being embarrassed by a man who probably didn't even know how to use a verb in English properly. "I accept," she said, and her voice came out stronger than she had expected. Richard's smile dropped for a split second. "What's that?" "I accept your offer, Mr. Blackwood. I will serve you in Chinese, and when I'm done, you will pay me the 100,000 here in front of everyone." While everyone mocked the waitress who dared to accept the impossible challenge, her eyes showed a calmness that only exists in those who have survived much worse storms and kept secrets too powerful to be shown before the right time. If this story of prejudice and reversal has you hooked, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next is something no one will ever forget. Richard clapped slowly, the sound bouncing through the room like gunshots. "Perfect. Then let's make this more interesting." He turned to the Japanese investors, his mean smile spreading even wider. "Gentlemen, you have just seen typical arrogance. This employee really thinks she can impress us." Hiroshi Tanaka, the oldest investor, fixed his glasses with clear discomfort. "Richard, perhaps it would be better." No, Hiroshi." Richard cut him off, raising his hand. "You need to understand how things work here. These people live in a fantasy world." He waved dismissively at Jasmine. "I bet she watched a few kung fu movies and thinks she can impress you with a few random words." The second investor, Kenji Yamamoto, frowned. His English was perfect without an accent. "This is getting uncomfortable, Richard." "Uncomfortable?" Richard laughed loudly. "This is educational. You want to invest in New York? You need to understand the reality." He pointed at Jasmine. "This woman probably didn't even finish high school. She works here because she's good for nothing else." Jasmine stayed still, but inside memories took her back 3 years when her life had meaning. Dr. Jasmine Williams, full professor of computer linguistics at Columbia University, expert in natural language processing, fluent in 9 languages, international speaker wanted by large corporations. Everything changed with a phone call in the middle of the night. "Your mother had a stroke. Serious." Dorothy Williams, 58, Jasmine's only family, was in a coma. The medical bills started as a trickle and became a flood. Health insurance denied. Experimental treatments not covered. Intensive therapies. Jasmine sold everything. Her Manhattan apartment, her car, her jewelry, even her collection of rare books. She took a break from the university, then a sabbatical, then simply couldn't go back. When Dorothy finally woke up after 6 months, she was different. She needed round-the-clock care, physical therapy, expensive medications. Insurance had limits. Did Jasmine have a choice? The medical debt reached $800,000. She declared bankruptcy. The university filled her position. Colleagues stopped returning her calls. Friends disappeared when they realized she was no longer useful to their careers. Do you know what the problem is with you people? Richard kept going, now completely drunk on his own power. You always want more than you deserve, always trying to be something you're not. Jasmine blinked, coming back to the present. She watched Richard wave dramatically, not knowing that he was about to face someone with a PhD in applied linguistics from MIT, specializing in Chinese dialect study, who had given master classes on Mandarin tone changes to crowded graduate classes. Do you know how many languages I speak? Richard asked the investors like it was obvious. English and money, and that's all that matters in the real world. Yuki Sato, the third investor, who had stayed quiet, finally spoke up. His English had a slight accent, but it was precise. Maybe we should give her a real chance, too. A real chance? Richard laughed. Yuki, you're too kind. But look at her. Really look. He pointed at Jasmine with disgust. This woman carries trays for a living. She can probably barely afford rent for a one-room apartment in the Bronx. He wasn't wrong. Jasmine shared a tiny apartment with 3 other people. Worked 2 jobs. Waitress at the Prestige Club at night. Caregiver at a clinic during the day. She slept 5 hours a night when she was lucky. Every penny went to her mother's medication, physical therapy, basic survival expenses. But Richard didn't know that she still had access to academic portals. That she studied computer linguistics in the early hours of the morning, when she couldn't sleep. That she talked with researchers in Beijing in fluent Mandarin. That her thesis on neural language processing had been mentioned in more than 200 international papers. Let's set the rules clearly, Richard announced, clearly enjoying himself. She can make a convincing order in Chinese, not single words, but a complete presentation of the menu with detailed explanations. I'll pay the $100,000. Hiroshi tried again. Richard, this really isn't necessary. But Richard kept going, completely ignoring the objection. When she fails, and she will fail badly, she will kneel right here and say sorry to every person in this restaurant for wasting our time. A heavy silence fell over the hall. Even the waiters stopped moving. Diners at other tables had turned completely to watch the show. And what's more, Richard couldn't stop. She'll publicly admit that she tried to trick us, that she's nothing but a desperate fraud craving attention. Yuki shook his head, clearly disturbed. This isn't right. It's absolutely right. Richard slammed his fist on the table, making the glasses shake. You want to do business with me? You need to understand how I operate. I don't tolerate lies. I don't tolerate acting. And I definitely don't tolerate anyone trying to make me look like an idiot. Jasmine watched everything with the calm of someone who had already lost much more than her dignity. 3 years of waiting tables had taught her that there are times to back down and times to push forward. This was a time to push forward. I accept all conditions, she said calmly. Oh. Richard laughed in disbelief, even kneeling and saying sorry when you fail. Even that. And publicly admitting that you're a fraud. If I fail, yes. Richard turned to the investors, his arms open in a dramatic gesture. Gentlemen, you are about to see a valuable lesson in the difference between real confidence and delusion. He had no idea that every cruel word that came out of his mouth was feeding a force that was growing in the silence. A determination built by 3 years of embarrassment that was about to find its outlet in the most crushing way possible. As everyone present got ready to watch what they thought would be yet another display of power over the weak. No one noticed the almost invisible flash of satisfaction that passed through Jasmine's eyes. The look of someone who had finally found the perfect opportunity to show that some battles are won long before they are fought. Very well. Then let's begin this show, Richard announced, clapping his hands like a circus director. But first I need to make sure there's no cheating. He waved to a nearby waiter. Bring the special Chinese menu, the one we use for investors from Shanghai. The waiter hesitated. Mr. Blackwood, that menu has over 40 different dishes with very specific technical descriptions. Perfect. Richard laughed loudly. If our language expert really knows Chinese, she won't have any trouble with a few technical details, right? Hiroshi Tanaka shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Richard, this is becoming cruel. Maybe we should cruel. Richard cut him off. Hiroshi, you don't understand. This is teaching. These people need to learn their limits. He pointed at Jasmine. Look at her. She still keeps that arrogant pose. She still believes she can fool us. What Richard didn't know was that at that very moment, Jasmine was mentally reviewing her doctoral thesis on dialect changes in contemporary Mandarin. 3 years ago, she had spent 6 months in Beijing as a visiting researcher at the China Foreign Languages University, studying regional food terminology specifically. Her advisor, Professor Chen Ming, had been extremely strict. Doctoral candidate Williams, he would often say in Mandarin, if you can't explain a Sichuan dish using the correct Beijing tones, how do you expect to translate trade agreements for multinational corporations? Jasmine had cried with frustration many nights in that small apartment in Beijing, memorizing not only vocabulary, but cultural details, regional changes, cooking slang that only native chefs knew. She had presented her research in fluent Mandarin to a panel of Chinese professors who questioned her for 2 hours straight without a single word of English. While we wait for the menu, Richard kept going, clearly amused. How about she tells us a little about her experience with languages? He made air quotes with disgust. Where exactly did you learn Chinese watching movies with subtitles? Yuki Sato, who had stayed relatively quiet, finally spoke up. Richard, may I ask a question? His English was precise, formal. Why is this so important to you? Because Richard leaned back in his chair. You are considering investing $200 million with me. You need to understand how I operate, how I spot people who try to pass themselves off as something they are not. He waved dramatically. This woman is clearly lying about her abilities. And if I can't spot such an obvious lie, how can you trust my judgment for investments? Kenji Yamamoto shook his head. That doesn't make any sense, Richard. Even if she doesn't know Chinese, that has nothing to do with her business skills. It does. Richard slammed his fist on the table. It's about integrity, about honesty, about not tolerating people who try to trick me. What none of them realized was that while Richard was speaking, Jasmine was watching every detail. In the last 6 months of serving at the Prestige Club, she had developed a strange skill, reading people, especially powerful and arrogant people. Richard Blackwood was an open book to anyone who knew the right pages. He constantly mentioned his Asian investors, always saying Japanese names wrong, always making completely wrong cultural references. Last week, she had served a table where he tried to impress Korean clients by talking about ancient Chinese traditions. The man was a cultural fake disguised as an international tycoon. Here it is, Richard announced when the waiter brought a leather-bound menu. Special menu straight from our chefs in Shanghai. 3 dishes, each with a full technical description. He opened the menu and his face changed slightly. For a second, he seemed less confident. Well, there are a lot of characters here, he muttered. Hiroshi leaned over to see. Can I take a look? No. Richard quickly closed the menu. She needs to do this on her own without help. He handed the menu to Jasmine. Come on, expert. Describe 5 different dishes in Chinese in detail. Jasmine took the menu, opened it to the first page, and almost smiled. It was exactly the kind of menu she had studied thoroughly in Beijing. She right away recognized several Sichuan specialties that she had not only studied, but prepared during her cultural immersion classes. Can I choose which dishes? She asked calmly. Of course, Richard laughed. Choose the easiest ones if you want. You're going to fail anyway. What Richard couldn't imagine was that at that moment Jasmine was mentally flipping through her memory for the presentation she had given at Beijing University on the evolution of food terminology in contemporary Mandarin. She had defended that presentation to an audience of 200 people, including food critics and famous chefs. Before I begin, Jasmine said, looking straight at Hiroshi, I would like to confirm something with you, gentlemen. Are you fluent in Mandarin? Hiroshi blinked in surprise. I speak a little, but what about you, Mr. Yamamoto? Kenji shook his head.
Just the basics.
Why do you ask? Richard laughed loudly. So you're already making excuses. Oh, you guys won't understand anyway. He copied a childish voice, pathetic. Actually, Jasmine kept going calmly. I asked because I want to make sure there will be at least one person qualified to judge my pronunciation, tone, and correct use of sounds. Yuki Sato sat up straight in his chair. I'm fluent, he said slowly. I was born in Osaka, but I lived in Taiwan for 10 years. My Mandarin is good. Richard hesitated for the first time. Well, that's of course perfect, but inside he was starting to feel a hint of nervousness. Until that moment, Jasmine's steady confidence had been just irritating. Now it was starting to seem real. There's one more thing, Jasmine kept going. You mentioned that this is about integrity and honesty. May I suggest we make it more interesting? How so? Richard asked, his voice slightly less confident. If I can not only describe 5 dishes in Mandarin, but also explain their regional origins, preparation techniques, and cultural meaning, you double the bet to $200,000. The silence that followed was complete. Even the waiters stopped moving. And if I fail, Jasmine kept going. In addition to kneeling and saying sorry, I'll work for free at this restaurant for an entire month. Richard stared at her. For a moment, he seemed to want to refuse, but with all eyes on him, especially those of the Japanese investors, he couldn't appear weak. 200,000, he repeated slowly. That's right. And you work for free for a month if you fail. Correct. Hiroshi tried to step in one last time. This has gone too far. I accept, Richard announced, reaching his hand to Jasmine. 200,000 if you succeed. A month of slave labor if you fail. Jasmine shook his hand firmly. Deal. What she didn't say, what she kept carefully hidden behind that calm face, was that 3 years ago she had been invited by the Chinese ambassador to the United States to a dinner, where she translated at the same time diplomatic speeches on international food cooperation. What she didn't mention was that her thesis had been published by Cambridge University Press under the title Linguistic Bridges: How Food Vocabulary Shows Cultural Evolution in Modern Mandarin. What she didn't reveal was that for 6 months straight, she had eaten with Chinese families in Beijing, discussing old recipes and dialects that not even all natives understood. As Richard got ready to watch what he believed to be the ultimate embarrassment of a mere waitress, Jasmine took a deep breath and got ready to show the difference between arrogance based on privilege and confidence built on real knowledge. The menu was open before her. The investors leaned forward. The entire restaurant held its breath. And then, with all the calm of someone who had faced Chinese academic panels that would make Richard Blackwood cry with fear, Jasmine began to speak in Mandarin so perfect and smooth that even Yuki Sato's eyes widened in surprise. At that moment, as the first words came out of her mouth with the accuracy of someone who had spent years studying not only the language, but the cultural soul behind each sound, it became clear that this would not just be a lesson in languages. It would be a masterclass in how true skill always finds a way to show itself, especially when underestimated by those who confuse money with intelligence. Good evening, gentlemen. Allow me to introduce our special selection for tonight, Jasmine said in Mandarin, her pronunciation so perfect that Yuki Sato right away sat up straight in his chair, his eyes wide. It wasn't just fluency. It was academic, formal Mandarin with exact tones that showed years of intensive study. Jasmine kept going, her voice flowing like music. We will begin with authentic Sichuan mapo tofu, prepared with 2-year-old Sichuan chili peppers, following the traditional technique of Master Chen of Chengdu, she explained in Mandarin. Richard blinked in confusion. Wait, is that real Chinese? Yuki raised his hand, asking for silence, completely fascinated. Jasmine kept going. This dish represents the cooking philosophy of balancing mala, the numbness of Sichuan pepper with the heat of red chilies. The silky texture of tofu shows the harmony between simplicity and complexity, she said in perfect Mandarin. My God, Yuki muttered in English, looking at the other investors. She's not just speaking Mandarin. She's explaining food philosophy with vocabulary that not even all Chinese people know. Richard's face started to pale. That has to be a trick. Jasmine turned to him and for the first time that evening smiled. Would you like me to continue in Beijing dialect, Hong Kong Cantonese, Or perhaps Taiwanese Mandarin, Mr. Blackwood, she asked calmly in English. What do you mean by different dialects? Richard stammered. Well, Jasmine replied, and then began to speak in fluent Cantonese. In Hong Kong, we would present the same dish with a different cultural approach, focusing on the traditions of Qing dynasty tea houses, she explained in Cantonese. Yuki slammed his hand on the table. Perfect Cantonese, real Hong Kong accent. Richard was clearly desperate now. Who the hell are you? Jasmine paused, looked at him with crushing calm, and replied, I am Dr. Jasmine Williams, Ph.D. in Computer Linguistics from Columbia University, specializing in natural language processing, fluent in 9 languages, former full professor, visiting researcher at Beijing Foreign Studies University, author of Linguistic Bridges, How Food Vocabulary Shows Cultural Evolution in Modern Mandarin, published by Cambridge University Press. The silence that followed was complete. I worked as a live translator for the UN, for embassies, for international conferences. 3 years ago, I gave up everything to take care of my mother when she had a stroke. The medical bills made me bankrupt. Her voice did not shake once. Hiroshi was speechless. You're a real doctor, with a postdoctoral degree in Chinese dialect study from MIT? Jasmine replied calmly. I spent 6 months in Beijing studying regional food terminology specifically for my thesis. Richard tried to recover, but his voice came out choked. That's impossible. A doctor can't be working as a waitress. Jasmine cut him off. Why not, Mr. Blackwood? Don't doctors need to eat? Don't they need to pay bills? Can't they have sick families who need care? Yuki stood from his chair. Richard, you just tried to publicly embarrass one of the most qualified academics I've ever met. I didn't know. Richard begged desperately. Exactly, said Jasmine, her voice cutting like a knife. You didn't know, but you assumed. You looked at a black woman waiting tables and decided she was ignorant, uneducated, inferior. Kenji shook his head in disbelief. Richard, what kind of person are you? Let me finish the presentation. Jasmine kept going back to Mandarin. The second course is Peking duck prepared according to the technique of the Quanjude. Restaurant started in 1864. The 24-hour soaking process and traditional fruit wood oven create the signature crispy skin that represents centuries of cooking refinement, she explained with technical perfection. Richard was sweating now. The people at the other tables had stopped pretending not to be paying attention. Everyone was watching, fascinated. The third dish, Jasmine kept going in Mandarin, is Shanghai Xiaolongbao, where each dumpling contains exactly 18 folds, a number that represents prosperity in Chinese culture. The broth inside is made with hardened pork marrow that liquefies in steam, a technique developed during the Ming Dynasty. Yuki was quickly translating for the others in English. She's explaining historical and technical details that only master chefs know. This is amazing, stop! Richard suddenly yelled, banging his fist on the table. Stop this act! This is a setup. You guys planned this. Set up what? Yuki turned to him, her voice cold. That she knows more about Chinese culture than you ever dreamed of learning. She can't be a doctor and be working here. Richard was clearly panicking now. Why not? Hiroshi asked coldly. Because people like you believe that intelligence and education are the private property of the rich. Jasmine placed the menu on the table. Mr. Blackwood, you offered me $200,000 to do something I was doing professionally 5 years ago before life knocked me down. Technical description of Chinese cuisine was literally part of my research area. This can't be happening, Richard muttered, running his hands through his hair. It is happening, Yuki said, taking his cell phone out of his pocket. And you know what, Richard? My company was considering a $200 million partnership with you. He started typing no, wait. Richard stood up desperately. A man who publicly embarrasses a brilliant scholar out of pure prejudice is not someone we do business with, Kenji said, also taking out his phone. You can't cancel everything because of a misunderstanding, Richard begged. Misunderstanding? Hiroshi laughed without humor. You tried to destroy this woman's dignity for fun. That's not a misunderstanding. It's cruelty. Jasmine watched Richard fall apart, but felt no satisfaction. Only a deep sadness that men like him existed. Mr. Blackwood, your $200,000, please. With shaking hands, Richard opened his wallet and began counting the bills. Each bill he placed on the table seemed to strip away a piece of his arrogance. "Now," Jasmine said when he was finished, "I would like you to say sorry, not to me, but to all the people who have had to deal with your prejudices over the years." Richard looked around. The entire restaurant was watching. Important clients, high society people, all seeing his complete embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "I didn't hear you," Jasmine said calmly. "I'm sorry," Richard yelled, his voice bouncing through the silent hall. It was at that moment, as one of the most powerful men in Manhattan publicly asked forgiveness for his ignorance, that everyone realized they had just seen something much greater than simple revenge. They had seen how true greatness always finds a way to show itself, especially when tested by small tyrants who confuse money with moral superiority. 6 months later, Jasmine was in her office on the 47th floor of a skyscraper in Manhattan, Director of Cross-Cultural Relations at Tanaka Yamamoto International. She earned $180,000 a year and had become a reference in multicultural corporate communication. Yuki Sato had personally offered her the position after that memorable night. "People with your intelligence and dignity are exactly what we need to expand our business globally," he said in perfect Japanese, a language Jasmine also spoke fluently. Her mother, Dorothy, now received the best medical care. They had moved to a spacious apartment on the Upper West Side. Her recovery was slow but steady. Richard Blackwood was not so lucky. The story of his public embarrassment had spread across social media, going viral with the headline, "Racist Tycoon Destroyed by Dr. Waitress." The video recorded by customers reached 15 million views. Japanese investors not only canceled the $200 million partnership, but spread the story in international business circles. Other investors pulled out. Banks questioned loans. His construction company went bankrupt in 3 months. His wife filed for divorce, taking half of the remaining money. His adult children cut off contact, ashamed. Richard lost his Manhattan apartment, his luxury car, his reputation. "He tried to put me down because he believed his money made him superior," Jasmine thought during a lecture at Columbia University, where she had returned as a guest speaker. But he discovered that intelligence, dignity, and skill cannot be bought in a store. In the audience, students gave her a standing ovation. Some cried, inspired by her journey of beating the odds. Richard now works as a salesman at a car dealership in Queens, earning minimum wage. He sometimes sees Jasmine on the business news, always as a respected expert on TV shows. Jasmine learned that the best revenge is not to destroy those who hurt you. It is to build something, so big that their pettiness becomes irrelevant. She turned years of embarrassment into fuel for a success that no prejudiced person could have imagined. Life tried to silence her, but she responded with excellence. Racism tried to limit her, but she expanded beyond any boundaries. Arrogance tried to embarrass her, but she rose above all expectations. If this story of beating the odds has touched you, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that our greatness is not measured by skin color, origin, or current circumstances, but by the strength to never accept being less than who we really are.